Peter, you've written quite extensively about mass higher education. Why is that important, and what's its relevance at the current time?
Well, I think there are two reasons. I mean, first of all, I find it fascinating in academic and intellectual terms. I believe that higher education systems have been totally transformed. They have a totally different situation in our society nowadays. Yet we haven't been very good at understanding that. We're sort of playing catch up, really, in terms of understanding what's happened. But the second reason is almost a more personal thing. I mean, I sort of grew up alongside mass higher education here in Britain. When I went to university, I think 8% of people went to higher education. Nowadays it's almost 45%. So I've kind of experienced it and watched it happen. So it's part of my life, but I'm also very interested in it intellectually.
But what are the implications of it? I mean, what's the impact of having so many people going to university, and are there benefits to that?
Oh, I'm sure there are immense benefits. If I could tell you a story, before I became a professor, when I was a journalist, I once interviewed Lord Robbins, who was the author of a great report in the 1960s, the man who really triggered mass higher education, the expansion of higher education here in Britain. Now, Robbins was a kind of fairly right-wing economist at the London School of Economics, and I naturally asked him why he'd supported the expansion of higher education, which wasn't a very popular idea at the time at all. There was a lot of talk about more means worse. Maybe that talk's still around. Anyway, I can still always remember what he said. He said he'd been really persuaded by a remark made by a colleague of his at the London School of Economics, R.H. Tawney, who was a rather left-wing professor, Robbins being a rather right-wing professor. And Tawney had spent some of the time, the war years, in the United States, attached to the Washington Embassy in some way. And Tawney had said to Robbins, you should never underestimate how much America has been improved by the fact that so many of her people have had at least a smell of a higher education. And Robbins liked that phrase, the smell of a higher education. So no, I think the expansion of higher education is a key element in being a democratic society. It's important for lots of other reasons as well, in terms of the kind of the higher skills we need, the global knowledge economy, all those sort of ideas. But I see it essentially in terms of social emancipation of people having their rights. So it has very, very big implications.
So do you think that this greater participation in higher education has fundamentally changed the way that universities deliver education, and that would that have an impact on the benefits of the education that's being received?
Well, it's certainly the very fact that we have many more students means that universities have to be organised differently. But there have been lots of other important social and technological changes at the same time. The kind of rise of information and communication technology, social networking, and of course nowadays, I mean, means that people, I think students expect to kind of engage in learning and teaching in quite different ways from students of a generation ago even. So yes, it's had very, very big implications for that. And to some extent, I think universities are playing catch up. Many, of course, people teaching in higher education are more of my generation and have had a much more traditional experience. And sometimes it's quite difficult for them, I think, to adjust really to the way that students now actually learn, really. Of course, we have to avoid becoming grumpy old men and saying everything's gone to the dogs. It's just different. But
when we're talking about, I mean, mass higher education, I mean, it's a social aspiration, but also universities have an aspiration to broaden their student base more generally. And a lot of universities are looking to internationalisation as part of that, and the internationalisation of the curriculum and their international agenda. Is internationalisation something that could ever really be achieved, given how universities are seated within their own cultures?
Well, I suppose some people would come back if you said that and say, well, universities have always been international institutions. You go back to the Middle Ages. And I was originally a historian, so in a way I'm quite interested in the history of universities as well. So we've always had international students, and we've always had scholars and scientists moving around the world and taking positions in universities in different countries. But I think it is different now. It's different in two respects. First of all, the scale of it. I mean, just the number of people who are internationally mobile. I've spent 2 years myself as a student at the University of California in Berkeley. And for me, that was a really formative experience in my life. So now it's really quite a routine experience for people to actually study in another country for at least some time. But the other big change, I think, is that now we see it much more in market terms, in kind of almost commercial terms. I think we see international higher education as a kind of market phenomenon, as much as a kind of a public service phenomenon, which is, I think it's still seen as very much in our own country, very much in terms of the public good. I think internationally it's seen much more in terms of a sort of trade in knowledge services, almost like a trade in international services. So that's been a big, big change.
Do you believe that the individual cultures within universities, I'm thinking, for example, of some of the European universities, the cultures within universities actually vary from region to region within country, yet these universities aspire to be international and recruit international students. What do you think are some of the challenges that they're going to have to overcome in order to be able to achieve those aspirations? And are those aspirations the right aspirations to have anyway?
Well, I suppose one of the arguments, there are two arguments. One argument is, of course, lots of people will now have international careers. They won't spend all their career, all their lives in one country. And particularly perhaps when they're younger, they move around quite a lot. So it's really important that people have experience of other cultures, really, because it prepares them for what's going to happen to them in their future lives. But the second thing, I think, in relation to internationalisation is, of course, that I think once we saw an international experience as something which was for kind of elite students from Oxford and Cambridge and the London School of Economics or Imperial College and so on, but then there should be local universities that people went to. Well, now, if you look at London, for example, London is a multicultural city. I mean, local students are also multicultural students, also international global students. So there's no kind of separation as there once used to be, I think.
So what do you think the challenges are for universities? If it's a correct aspiration, how do you balance between providing a truly international experience with all the benefits that comes with that, with actually ensuring that people are receiving an education that's worthy of a university education?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily in conflict, but I think there is potentially a conflict or a tension at any rate between the pressure on universities to serve national needs, in a sense to service the kind of training needs, the research needs of UK PLC, that kind of idea, and that Britain, the UK, is having to compete in this global knowledge economy, and that's the function of universities, to prepare us to compete more successfully. So that's really a national agenda. And there is a tension perhaps between that and the kind of the international agenda, which is much more about international understanding, cultural awareness, those sort of broader issues. Nevertheless, I think the two can be combined in a modern university, and I think in most cases they are very successfully combined.
Higher education it has been argued that higher education has changed beyond recognition in the last 20 years, and we've touched upon mass higher education and we've touched upon internationalisation. What do you think are going to be the major changes looking forward?
Well, the major changes are, I suppose, not just here in the UK but in many other countries, the very difficult issue of charging student fees. Of course, many postgraduate students already are charged fees, but typically undergraduate students were not until fairly recently charged fees in the UK, and of course in many other European countries there were still no fees. So there is a kind of a very difficult transition, I think, in persuading people to invest in their higher education as consumers or customers rather than simply as taxpayers and citizens. I'm a bit old-fashioned on that point, and I quite like the idea we should engage more as citizens than as taxpayers, but nevertheless I have to be realistic. Because of the sheer cost of providing modern higher education systems, the very scale, but also the sophistication of teaching. I mean, teaching is no longer just a question of someone standing in front of a blackboard or giving a long, probably boring 30 or 60-minute lecture. It's much more interactive. You need more technology to enable it. And these are very, very expensive costs.
So how do you think that's going to play out? Because you could argue that fees are going to be a shock, but the market would stabilise and people would adapt to that. What do you think the implications of that will be?
Well, one implication, I suppose, is that, very broadly speaking, for 80% of students, because of the social backgrounds, the families they come from, going to higher education has become pretty much a compulsory experience for them. They have no choice. If they want to get the kind of job they aspire to, they have to have a degree. So for them, in a sense, they will probably have to pay whatever it costs, although they will still protest, I have to say.
Yeah.
My concern is for the 20%, where they come from families where there isn't that experience of higher education, where many of their peers may not want to go to university. So they still need a lot of encouragement and support. And my concern is that higher fees will discourage students from those kind of backgrounds.
So do you think we're going to see a move away from mass higher education back towards the more elite?
No, I don't, because I think the pressures are so strong in two ways. First of all, economically. Every year the number of jobs for non-graduates dwindles, and the number of jobs for graduates increases. And that's happening here in Britain, it's happening in every country. So in a way, if you want to have a decent job, increasingly I think you have to be a graduate. But secondly, I think in a sense to participate more fully in our society, to be sort of fully emancipated, to participate fully as a citizen, you probably do have had to have some experience of higher education. Going back to what I said earlier about Lord Robbins' quote, the smell of a higher education.
So do you think that in 20 years' time there'll be less or more universities than there are now?
I think there will be both more and less. There'll be more in the sense, I think there'll be many more private providers, private universities. Maybe not having masses of students, but I think they will be an important feature of the landscape here in the UK, but probably worldwide as well. I also think that local colleges, now mainly delivering further education, may become quite important local providers of higher education. So in that sense, I think there'll be more. It'll be a much more diverse kind of landscape. But there might be fewer universities in the sense that there might be mergers between universities.
So thank you, Peter. Thank you for your time. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. It's been very interesting to talk to you. It's always interesting to talk about what you're interested in.